I get a lot of questions about my schedule, like how often I'm flying, if I get long layovers, where am I flying to. Thought it'd be fun to do like a flight schedule review of all of 2023. This was my first full year flying the 747 for Atlas. I've done, 3 passenger flights, and the rest have been all cargo. We fly to some crazy places all over the world. A lot of domestic flying, but mostly international. Here is my 2023 flight schedule as a first officer at Atlas. A couple things. The first half of the year, I was based in Chicago, but I live in Phoenix. When it shows Chicago to Rockford here, for instance, I'm actually coming from Phoenix. So Phoenix to Rockford, really Phoenix to Chicago, and then driving to Rockford. So at the beginning of my trip and the end of my trip, it'll say I'm coming from Chicago. 90% of the time, I am coming from Phoenix or going home to Phoenix, not Chicago. But most of my trips started and ended in Chicago for the first half of the year. And then the last few months, I was Los Angeles based. So you'll see the same thing. We are looking at January, really December 31st to January 2023. Dark blue is deadheading, and then light blue is a flight that I'm actually operating. So I'm either the first officer that's doing the takeoff and landing, or I'm the first officer that's with the captain who is doing the takeoff and landing, or I could even be in the back 2 seats as a required crew member in one of the observation seats. And you still have, duties to do when you're in those observation seats. Typically for long flights, we have a crew of 4. So everybody's doing something during pre-flight, takeoff, and landing. But when we're up in cruise, we split it up, and 2 of us are flying and 2 of us are in the back doing whatever we want. We could be sleeping, we could just be hanging out, listening to podcasts, watching Netflix, whatever, eating food. Another note is if there's a $sign up here, that means I'm working on my day off. For instance, this is just training. So I did bid to do my training on my days off so that I'd get paid a little bit extra. I could have picked to do my training on one of my scheduled days on. Where did I go in January 2023? Rockford to Anchorage, Anchorage to Mexico, and then to Indianapolis. Pretty easy flying there. And then I was done. Had a couple days off. And I know I picked this schedule in January because I closed down bought a house on the 12th, and needed these days off. So that's why I picked this schedule. There was flying early on in the month and then later on in the month. So that's why I picked that schedule. For this one, I went from, this is Fort Hood, GRK is Fort Hood, to Baltimore. I repositioned a passenger plane with no passengers on it. I think there was like 10 flight attendants or something, but this plane came over from, I'm not even sure where, somewhere in Europe, landed in Fort Hood, and I picked it up in Fort Hood and flew it back to Baltimore. And then from Baltimore, they deadheaded me to Nashville. Nashville's BNA. And I operated Nashville to Chicago. That's a nice short flight. And then Chicago to Memphis. Yes, I did do that. Yep. Okay, Chicago to Memphis, deadheaded there again. And then I flew Memphis to Puerto Rico. SJU is Puerto Rico. And then back to Memphis. That was for a FedEx flight. We actually did use a FedEx call sign, but we're flying our plane. Memphis to Chicago. So a unique thing about Atlas is that they will buy my ticket confirmed seat to get me to and from work. Kind of no other airline does that. If I wanted to live in Phoenix and be a pilot for Delta, I would have to find my own way to work in LA or Minneapolis or Atlanta, wherever I would be based. So very unique benefit of working for Atlas. And then I had training. I had recurrent training. This was just our 6-month recurrent training. It wasn't a full check ride. It was just a little simulator scenario thing. But we need to do recurrent training every 6 months. And then finish the month with a couple days off. In February, I actually used my 2 weeks of vacation to be able to get the entire month off of February. Like I said, in January I bought a house, and I used February to furnish my condo that I moved out of into an Airbnb, and then also furnished my house to turn 2 of those rooms into an Airbnb. So I was very busy in February. It was a very busy month. So I fly half the month and then am off half the month. But if I use 2 weeks of vacation, I can block off my 2 weeks of vacation for my flying days. So I'll have off for half the month and use my vacation for the other half of the month and get the entire month off with just 2 weeks of vacation used. Neat. In March 2023, had a couple days off. Let's see. I think this was a reserve line. So I was on reserve in Chicago. So they actually did fly me from Phoenix to Chicago, and I just sat around until they needed me to fly. It looks like I did fly quite a bit. Chicago to Rockford. I flew from Chicago to Rockford, operated that plane. It was a 24-minute flight. And then they limoed me back to Chicago. So I just drove back to Chicago. And then a day later, flew Chicago to Incheon, Korea. It had a nice layover there. Really nice hotel that we stay at. The Oakwood is amazing. Love it there. And then I flew Incheon to Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong to Anchorage. A 2-leg day is a really long day when you're flying these long of flights. So yeah, that's a common flight too. That's a 2-leg day. That happens a lot. We'll do like Incheon into China, and then China to Anchorage, or Incheon to Hong Kong, or Incheon to Vietnam, and all the way back up to Anchorage, Alaska. I had a day and a half off in Anchorage, and then flew from Anchorage to Narita, Japan, and then had about 2 days off in Narita, and then I flew Narita to Anchorage. That's a pretty short flight. There's a pretty good layover. That's almost 3 days. Yeah, that's about 3 days in Incheon, and then we did Incheon to Singapore, and then back up to Incheon. Incheon to Anchorage, and then I was deadheading from Anchorage to Poland. Oh, this is an overtime trip as well. So I finished in Anchorage, and I gave crew scheduling a call saying, hey, I'll just keep flying on my days off because it connects. So they left me in Anchorage, and they're like, okay, we'll find something for you. Sure enough, they did. So I deadhead from Anchorage to Poland, and then, oh yeah, that's right. This one. So this pink is interesting. We show up to the plane, and we get a no-go thing because there's no fuel on the airport. There was no fuel. So we were supposed to fly from Poland to Hong Kong, I believe. Yeah, that's what we did a day later. So we show up to the plane, and there's no fuel. So we actually get paid for that. I don't get paid for 2 hours maybe, but that was funny. It extended my days that I get paid for my working on my days off as well. So that was funny. The next day we did do Poland to Hong Kong, stay overnight in the Cordis. Awesome hotel as well. Hong Kong is just wild. And then I get deadheaded home, or commercialed home. I think I did deadhead on our plane from Hong Kong to Anchorage, stayed overnight in Anchorage, and then I probably flew Delta or something from Anchorage back to Phoenix, not Chicago. Again, at the end of my trip, they fly me back to Phoenix because that's where I live. But my base is Chicago, and they just put this in as a placeholder. I had a bunch of days off and volunteered to work on a day off. They're supposed to call me if something comes up, but apparently this month was kind of slow. Nothing came up. So had a bunch of days off in April, and then, let's see, deadheaded to Frankfurt, Germany. I don't remember if I commercialed there or flew on one of our own flights. It looks like I commercialed there. Pretty nice. This is another reserve line. So wherever they want me to be, they just send me there. Flew from Hahn, Germany, which is near Frankfurt. So Hahn, Germany to Djibouti, and then there to United Arab Emirates. That was pretty cool. That was a military flight. That was pretty fun. Went from there to deadheaded over to Dubai, and then back to Frankfurt. Han. Then we flew from Han to Poland. Not a very long flight, but not bad. RZE Poland, spent 2 days there. Poland to Hong Kong. Hong Kong to Anchorage. And then my trip was over. Anchorage to Chicago, which again, Anchorage to Phoenix. Not a bad month, actually. Called in sick, apparently. Late April? I don't remember that. Chicago to Anchorage. Anchorage to Nashville. Nashville back to Chicago. Cincinnati to Anchorage. Anchorage back to Chicago. Phoenix. A couple days off. A lot of days off. Man, I don't remember that having that long of a stretch off. Let's see. Next start of the trip. This is Charleston. This is where I flew the Dreamlifter, the 747 that is so big that we fit other planes inside of our plane. So we flew from Charleston to Wichita, Kansas, and then on to Seattle. In Wichita, we picked up a 787 fuselage and put it in our plane and flew it to Payne Field in Seattle to get it produced, to get it built. It was pretty awesome. And then Seattle back to Chicago. This must have been a reserve line in Chicago again. And then Chicago to Nashville. That was a deadhead on a commercial flight on United. And Nashville to Chicago. Operated that flight. Cool. I think one of these days I actually drove up to Wisconsin to see family. So I was in Chicago long enough with a 32-hour guaranteed rest that I drove up and saw family. We're in June. A couple days off. This is a reserve in Chicago again. I'm kind of surprised that I kept picking these reserve lines. Let's see, Chicago to Travis Air Force Base in Northern California, and then from there to Honolulu. 1 day off in Honolulu. I remember that I did surf lessons in the morning, and then I met up with a friend who's an Air Force pilot in Honolulu. So that was a good day. It was a short layover. It was like 17 hours, but made the most of it. And then deadheaded Honolulu all the way back to Chicago. That was on United, so got a nice first class ticket from Honolulu to Chicago. Chicago to Anchorage, 2.5 days in Anchorage. That's not bad. It is summertime in May. Or no, we're in June. Okay, so June in Anchorage, there's just tourists everywhere. It's like you can't get a seat at a table in any restaurant in Anchorage because there's all these cruise ships that come in and just there's tourists everywhere. It's like, Anchorage to Chicago. And you know what? This month, I remember that I didn't have a passport because I needed to submit my passport to the Chinese consulate to get a Chinese visa so that I could fly into China. So they had my passport for like 3 or 4 weeks. So I had to only fly domestically on this month. A couple days off. A lot of days off. And a reserve in Chicago. I'm just sitting around in Chicago. No flights. I do stay near the airport, so I could have went out and done stuff, but I don't even remember what I did on these reserve days. But I'm not flying, so when I'm on reserve, I'm like contactable for about 12 hours. Yeah, so 12 hours of the day I need to have my phone on and be ready to fly and ready to get to the airport within 90 minutes. So when I'm on reserve, I really can't go out and do stuff. I can't go downtown Chicago and go see a Cubs game or anything. So kind of sucks, but I don't know, it's fine. Finally get called to fly Chicago to Anchorage, Anchorage to Incheon, Korea, and then done. Korea to Chicago. And then this flight, I remember, did go into my days off, so I actually did get paid overtime at the end of my trip because they didn't get me home in time. So I did actually fly from Incheon to Chicago, and then my brother bought a house, and I helped him move in the first couple days here. I believe that was the first week of July, right? Yeah, I think so. I had a couple days off. I remember yeah, flying home. So I was in Wisconsin July 4th, flew home on July 4th to Phoenix, flew home to Phoenix and got to Phoenix July 4th. And then I know I flew back to Wisconsin and used some leave there in the middle of the month for a funeral, and then went back to work on the 22nd. A couple days of reserve. Flew Chicago to Miami. This is training. So this is my check ride. Like once a year we have to do a full-on check ride. It's called a proficiency check, and then we get a proficiency check warm-up, and I think this is just classroom and classroom. So 2 days of classroom and 2 days in the full motion simulators. So 4 full days of training in Miami in the middle of July. Kind of nice. August I flew from Chicago to JFK. That was fun. That was in the middle of the night, and I did a really crazy approach called RNAV to 13 left. That has this really crazy turn when you're at like 1,000 feet above the ground. It's a really crazy approach. Yeah, RNAV 13 left. Then we drove down from JFK all the way to Dover, and then we flew Dover to Ramstein, and then limoed over to Nuremberg for my first passenger flight. And then we flew Nuremberg to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then I drove down to Boston and flew Boston to Chicago, or really Boston to Phoenix. I was done with my trip there, so Boston to Phoenix. And again, that bled over into my days off, so I actually got paid overtime at the end of my trip for that. Bunch of days off. Volunteered to work. Nothing came up. So those were all days off. So I operated from Chicago to Anchorage. Deadheaded Anchorage back to Chicago. Chicago to Anchorage, very exciting. And then Anchorage to JFK, JFK to Dover, Dover to Poland. Some nice long layovers here. This one, yeah, JFK. This one I actually went downtown New York and walked around. This one, okay, this layover in Poland was pretty good. Poland to Incheon, Incheon to Taipei, Taipei to Anchorage. That was a long day. That was a 2-flight day. And then Anchorage back home to Chicago. Again, into my days off. Fine. Get paid some overtime. So it looks like I actually did pick up an overtime trip here in September. Chicago to LA, LA to Incheon, and then Incheon to Xiamen, China, and then Anchorage. So this was the overtime trip that I actually picked up, Incheon to XMN to Anchorage. But they had to get me there. So I deadheaded, and then actually flew this flight, operated it, and then went home from Anchorage to Phoenix. Couple days off. Chicago to Anchorage, Anchorage to Narita, Japan, Narita to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Anchorage, Anchorage to Miami, Miami to Amsterdam. This was a cool layover. Layover in Amsterdam, I went to the Rijksmuseum, and I wanted to go to a Van Gogh museum, but they were handing out this really rare Van Gogh Pokemon card, and you couldn't get same-day tickets to go to the Van Gogh museum. So I went to this other modern art museum. It was really cool. Yeah, nice long layover in Amsterdam. Flew Amsterdam, Chicago, and then Chicago to LA. LA to Anchorage, Anchorage to Incheon, and then I'm on reserve in Incheon. Okay, so for October, I bid for what's called an outbase, which means that I stay in the hotel in Incheon, South Korea, for the entire month, and I'm on reserve in Korea, flying around for a whole month. I didn't have anything going on in October in like my personal life, so I figured I'm going to fly this whole month. I'm going to bid for an outbase, and I'm just stationed in Incheon, Korea, and whatever comes up, that's what I fly. Flew the whole month of October, plus my trip in September connected with it. This is why they deadheaded me from Chicago all the way to Incheon. Yeah, it was a long month. I think I flew 43 days in a row, or I was gone from home for 43 days. Flew Incheon to Okinawa. DNA is a military base in Okinawa, and flew a passenger flight from Okinawa to Anchorage, bringing home a plane full of, it was like 350 Navy troops. So that was pretty cool. Anchorage to Incheon, Incheon to XMN, China. Layover there. So that was my first layover in China, I think. It was pretty good, actually. Nice place. XMN to Anchorage. Anchorage to Incheon. Incheon to Anchorage. Incheon to HGH. I forget where that is. Reserve for a couple days in Incheon. Actually, reserve for a long time in Incheon. So I had, let's call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's about 5 days where I didn't even fly. I'm just hanging out at the hotel waiting to fly. Incheon to Narita. Narita to Incheon. Incheon to China to Anchorage. A lot of Anchorage to Incheon flights, obviously. And that brings us done with October. Incheon to Anchorage, finished that one, and then Incheon to LA. Cool. So now I'm LA based, which I love because it's so much closer to Phoenix. Such a much shorter commute time going between Phoenix to LA and LA to Phoenix versus Chicago. So nice. A couple days off. LA to Vegas. So I started my trip, so I went from Phoenix to Vegas, and I picked up a plane that was unloading the F1 cars. So Red Bull and Ferrari was being offloaded from the plane when I picked up the plane, and we actually flew this plane empty from Las Vegas to Incheon. Incheon to LA. A couple days off. A lot of days off. And then I flew from LA to TAO is in China as well. China, Anchorage, LA. LA, TAO. TAO, Anchorage. Anchorage, LA. Picked up an overtime trip in December. Like Honolulu, Melbourne, Sydney. Of course I'm going to pick up that overtime. That was great. Had 1 or 2 days off in between that overtime trip and my next trip. LA to Incheon, Incheon, China, and then Almaty, Kazakhstan. That place was beautiful. It was very, very cold, but it was beautiful. Almaty to China, back to Almaty, Kazakhstan. And yes, we did stay at the Ritz-Carlton in Almaty. Very fancy place. And then I actually got sick in Almaty. Turned out to be COVID. I didn't know it at the time, but got really congested, pretty bad cough, and then got flown home commercially. So I flew from Almaty, Kazakhstan, down to Doha, Qatar, and then from Doha, Qatar, to Almaty to Qatar, and then Qatar to Seattle, and then Seattle to Phoenix. And the flight from Doha, Qatar to Seattle goes north over Iran, over Russia, and over the North Pole to Seattle. It was crazy flight, absolutely crazy. It was a very, very long flight, but like we're flying over Iran and Russia and the North Pole. It was like less than 20 or 30 miles away from the North Pole. It was insane. And this is a Qatar Airlines flight, so like no American carriers fly over Iran and Russia. So it was like, okay, this is happening. It's crazy. They just flew me home at the end of my trip because I was sick. And then, had the rest of December off. So, that was my 2023. And for this month in January, I had a recurrent training in the middle of the month. And now I'm on a trip. Oh, no, I picked up an overtime trip. That's right. But this overtime trip actually got canceled. They flew me from LA to Leipzig, Germany. And then when I got to Germany, the flight got canceled. So I had 2 days off in Leipzig, Germany, and I'm getting paid overtime just to be there. And then they flew me home. So didn't even fly the plane. So got lucky there. Just random 2-day trip in the middle of winter in Eastern Germany. and a couple days off. And here I am in Minot, North Dakota. I flew from LA to Minot, North Dakota yesterday, and I have a nice 2-day layover here, and it's cold. And there's nothing to do except make YouTube videos. So this is why we're doing it. I'm bored. It's cold, and there's nothing to do in Minot. Later this week, I'm going to fly down to Cincinnati and fly from Cincinnati to Japan, Japan to Incheon, China, China Anchorage, and that'll bring me into February. So, yeah, that's my 2023 flight schedule. Here's the totals for my flying in 2023. Normal days off, my normal schedule, 178. Overtime flying, 21 days. Days off, 159. And then I didn't really calculate this because I didn't really know where I was on my days off. Was I home in Wisconsin? Was I somewhere else in the country? Was I in Phoenix? I didn't really calculate that on this one. I did in 2022. And then 7 days of training. So not bad. That's a lot of days off. It's way more days off at home than 2022. In 2022, I spent about 4 months flying the 737. I spent 4 months in training, 100 days in training, and then about 3 or 4 months of flying the 747. So yeah, I was at home, not a lot. I flew a lot of overtime in 2022, mostly on the 737, but yeah, 2023. 2023 was way better for just having days off at home. Yeah, we'll just wrap it up there. Crazy schedule, crazy life flying the 747. I never know what countries I'm going to fly to next. You can guess Anchorage and Incheon. It's probably a good bet. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions. See ya.